Hi, human geographers. Welcome back. We're going to have a lecture on sexuality. And so we've been talking about race and racism, ethnicity, gender. We've been talking about marginalized populations within our culture. And one thing that a lot of people tend to do is compare oppressions. That's something that if we were in class, I would say, and I'll just say it right now, that you can't compare oppressions, that a lot of us get into a race to say like, well, it was much worse to be this than it was to be this. And no, it's worse today to be this because you don't have this. And then somebody will throw the Holocaust in there and nobody can argue with that, right? So the reason that I bring up the idea of comparing oppressions is it's just one of the ways that we fight with each other. And if we're constantly fighting over whose oppression is worse than another person's oppression, then we're not looking at the real problem. The real problem being a system of hegemony, a system of power. So there's really no point in comparing oppressions, for one, because like I said, it's all part of a system of hegemony, of power. And if we're all arguing over here, we're not looking and attacking that actual system, for one. And for two, it's hard to say the experience of anybody, the lived experience of anybody. So comparing the lived experience of one person to another person is really fruitless. What would be better is if we attempt to understand people in their positionality in society, understand them in their own personal history, so that we can gain a better understanding of all of us. So there was that one thing that I wanted to bring up. And all of the topics that we've had in the last couple of weeks, as if you remember, I said have to do with the term intersectionality. Intersectionality being that we can study race, but gender is going to come into a discussion on race. We can study gender, but race is going to come into a discussion on gender. Sexuality can come into both those discussions. That when we try to isolate a person is multiplicitous. A person has all sorts of parts of their personality. They're affected by their ethnicity, they're affected by their gender, they're affected by their sexuality, they're affected by their socioeconomic status, their geography, the schools that they went to, their family dynamics, et cetera, all those go into affecting and creating who we are. It's one of the reasons that comparing oppressions really doesn't do any good. So keep in mind that as we talked about gender, we also talked about people of color in terms of issues with gender. And when we talked about race and ethnicity, issues of gender and sexuality come up. And when we talk about sexuality, we don't want to ignore that sexuality might be viewed differently in different cultures, and that's going to affect your experience as well. So I have a couple books in case you're interested. Again, and this book has to do with intersectionality. Can we all be feminists? And it's a bunch of different essays from some great writers, like Roxane Gay is in here. She wrote a book called Hunger, which is very, very good. And then who else? Oh, we have Nicole Dennis-Benn. She is a fictional writer from Jamaica. She's queer. She wrote one of my very favorite books, which is Here Comes the Sun. This book has everything, you guys. This book has Jamaica. It has queer women. It has issues of colonization and sex work and sex tourism. It's very, very good. And then in talking about gender and sexuality, this is a book that came out last year. It's called Sissy, A Coming of Gender Story. And it's about this person, Jacob, who grew up in a Midwestern household and views gender as something, in their words, something that we can kind of put on and play with, rather than being the strict structure in society. So check this book out. All right, so let's talk about sexuality in our culture and in other cultures. And one thing that comes up when talking about sexuality, we're going to ultimately talk about the queer community. It's almost June, and June is Pride Month, and that's something that's become more and more popular in the last couple of years. And something that you might notice around Pride Month are reactions to Pride Month where people say things like, well, what about straight pride? And there was actually a group of people last year in Boston who attempted to have a straight pride parade. And so then now we're talking about straight pride versus gay pride, as though once again they're in opposition. Remember how comparisons just keep us fighting against each other so that we don't get to talk about the real issues? So one thing I want you to note, because June will come along, Pride Month will come along, and inevitably some people will say straight pride, notice that they don't say that at any other time of the year. That if there were a group of people who really cared about expressing their straight pride and having a whole festival or parade about it, that they would be constantly working on that throughout the year. It wouldn't just come up in contrast to queer pride. So I argue that the reason that anybody comes out with this idea that there has to be straight pride is just a way of refocusing the conversation back to that person. Because if we do want to have a straight pride parade, well, people should be advocating for it year round, not just when it comes up as in the context of gay pride or queer pride. And as you probably already know, but one of the reasons we don't need a straight pride parade is that there's never been a question as to your right to be a straight person and have a heterosexual relationship. And one of the reasons that we have gay pride, queer pride festivals and parades is because it still isn't totally okay for people to be queer and their relationships to be celebrated in the same way that heteronormative relationships are celebrated. So there you go. Let's look at sexuality. Okay, ooh, we have quotes of the day. James Baldwin again. And I think I gave you all I'm Not Your Negro as a documentary to watch for extra credit, and that's about James Baldwin. So I love this quote by James Baldwin. We can disagree and still love each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist, right? We can have disagreements. We don't always have to agree, but if our disagreement has to do with your rooting my oppression and your denial, well, I just tried to paraphrase it and that didn't work very well. Your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. Then it's not so much a disagreement, right? It's not a disagreement of opinion if you think that, queer people should still be burned at the stake like they were. If you remember, I talked about language and how different words in our culture show history, right? And the word that is used as a derogatory term towards queer people, the word that means bundle of sticks, got its start because when people in Europe were burning witches at the stake, they were also burning homosexuals. But instead of putting people on a stake and burning them alive, they just took them like the bundle of sticks and threw them directly into the fire. So if you want to have an argument about your right to use that word or any other oppressive word, it's not so much a discussion about a difference of opinion. It's a discussion about contributing to a narrative. And this narrative being, I'll have students who ask questions like, why can't I say the N word? Or why can't I say other words that are particularly oppressive towards a group of people? And the answer is, you can say the word. I mean, you can say the word, you're in control of your own language. But what you're doing when you say those words is you're contributing to a narrative of oppression. You're contributing to a narrative that has incarcerated people, murdered people, enslaved people, hurt people, burned people alive as a result of their race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, whatever it is. So of course you can say the words that you want to say, but keep in mind that when you say them, what you are contributing to and what you're taking a part of. And what you're taking a part of is that narrative of oppression. So there you go. I'm going to pause this and cough. Okay, I coughed. All right, our second quote is from Harvey Milk. If you don't know who Harvey Milk was, Harvey Milk is our first elected out political figure. So he is the first, let me say that again. He is the first openly gay elected political figure in the history of the US. Now, there's a couple things to note in there. So he's the first openly gay elected political official. Um, I say openly because there have been plenty of political officials who are not openly gay, who are what we say in the closet, right? But Harvey Milk ran 4 times in San Francisco. He ran as city supervisor. So a lot of people think he was the mayor. He was a supervisor, and he was supervisor to the Castro, which is traditionally a gay neighborhood for a long time in US history. Those 2 square blocks were basically the only place that people could be openly gay. And he ran 4 times, and he wasn't voted in 3 times. And then the 4th time in 1977, he ran in San Francisco. He was voted in. He started his term of office in 1978 in January, and by November he was killed. So he was shot by another supervisor, Dan White, who, among other things, had mental illness problems and had resigned from the city supervisor seat and then had tried to get his job back. And Harvey Milk adamantly lobbied the mayor, Moscone, at the time to not hire him back. And so he wasn't going to get his job back as city supervisor, and he shot Moscone and Harvey Milk. And when he did, he was put on trial, and he was given only 5 years, and he served 3 years of it. 3 years for shooting a mayor and another city supervisor. And they were done point blank range in their offices in City Hall. He had to sneak in the bottom of City Hall through a window so that he wouldn't get caught in the metal detector. And he made his way up, and he shot Moscone, and then he shot Harvey Milk. And he shot Harvey Milk in the back of the head while he was basically looking out over the city. So the reason I bring him up is it takes a lot of courage to be yourself, and particularly in 1970s US, and we're going to go into what it was like to be gay in different decades in the US. And also that he only got 5 years. And he only got 5 years on something called the Twinkie defense. The Twinkie defense being that he'd been eating sugary food, like junk food, for days and hadn't slept. And so, when you don't sleep and you eat too much junk food and then you shoot the mayor and a supervisor, oops. He was given 5 years, I would argue, because of an implicit and what's the word that I'm looking for when we not integrated, let's see the word, internalized. I think that there was an internalized idea that homosexuality was bad, and that people who were openly gay and who weren't fighting it through some kind of conversion therapy were devious. And I think that that attitude still persists, even though it doesn't persist nearly as much maybe as it did 40 years ago. But I would say that somebody who's given 5 years for shooting 2 people, there's something else going on there. And what was going on in that particular situation was a internalized homophobia. So he said, "Hope is never silent." And that quote is one of my favorite quotes. Hope is never silent. He, was himself. He was open about who he was in a time when it was really not okay to be open about who you were if you were gay. And he did it because if we want to be hopeful for a better world, you can't be silent about it, right? All right, so let's talk about, first of all, why we would talk about sexuality in a geography class. Well, remember, we're studying human culture and how human culture relates to physical geography, and how the argument is that our cultural barriers, our cultural concepts have a whole lot to do with adapting to an environment. And so when we look at something like sexuality is very much a part of culture. We've learned that with marriage, we've learned that with gender roles, right? We've learned that with other aspects all throughout the semester, and sexuality is one of those things. So I'm going to go through what all these letters are, and we're going to talk some transgender, we're going to talk some gender, we're going to talk some laws that still exist in the US and laws that used to exist in the US. And we're going to look at some other parts of the world, because once again, the study of geography is looking at different cultures in different places. And in some places, like in Holland, it is much more okay to be openly gay, whereas in Uganda, you can be murdered for it. Saudi Arabia, you can be murdered for it. In Iran, they have no gay people. Even though 1 in 10 of us are gay, Iran claims to have no gay people. So once again, you can kind of figure out what that means. So we study sexuality in geography because it has to do with cultural processes and because it changes around the world. Now, as you know, homosexuality is something that has not been widely accepted in culture, and a lot of people take that as a sign that it must be wrong. If people don't accept it, it must be because it's wrong, right? But it has a whole lot to do with our gender roles. And if you remember in this class, we've talked about how marriage developed and how marriage led to gender roles. And marriage developed as a function of the economy. Gender roles developed as a function of inheritance in a patriarchal society, and so did a movement away from homosexuality. So for a long time, if you think about Mesopotamia as being the place where marriage starts, so marriage begins there, and you have the beginning of these gender roles where women aren't supposed to have sex with a lot of people because otherwise you don't know the paternity of her child. So that is also the beginning of, if you are homosexual, you can't reproduce, right? So if we're looking at reproduction as a way of dispersing profit throughout generations, so if I own a lot of land, the way that I continue to keep that land inside my family is by having an heir. And that's not something you can easily do when you're in a same-sex partnership. So you don't see homosexuality go out of favor in different cultures nearly as quickly as you see marriage and gender roles introduced. It takes a while, but essentially you have men who can be married to a woman, but you can also still be having sex with other men or other women on the side, if that makes sense. So it didn't really become this demonized part of different cultures until we could take Europe, for example. Europe, when Europe becomes Christian, when Christianity moves into Europe and the spread of monotheism, the beginning of the Catholic Church leads to a lot of kind of new introductive ideas in Christianity. For example, the crucifixion is not a big part of the Bible, and it's not a big part of the Christian faith before you have this spread of Catholicism into Europe. The reason that story, the crucifixion, becomes a big story in the 5th century, that's also when Catholics start talking about angels as well. Angels are a central figure of Christianity. Catholicism kind of introduces the idea of angels. So what happens with Catholicism as it goes into Europe and the crucifixion, that story was a way of dividing the population of Europe. It was a way of creating a demonic version of Jews. If Jews are the people who killed Jesus, then let's create some sort of rift, because Jews were a population in Europe at the time. They were a minority. They're always going to be a minority, and minorities are always easy groups to blame. So we have to figure out a reason to blame them. For example, right now we have a narrative in the US that blames undocumented workers for a whole lot of problems. Undocumented workers are only about 3% of the US population. And the majority of those people are people who overstayed their visas. But that doesn't stop us from creating a narrative that says that people are just running across the border and they're coming in to murder us, right? So you have that similar narratives that are introduced and then become kind of a integrated part of that culture. And a big part of this class has been looking at when that narrative was introduced. So if we have the introduction of the crucifixion, and it might surprise people to know that that hasn't been part of Christianity from the beginning, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a story about Jesus dying. There was, it just wasn't nearly as central to the religion until that introduction of the crucifixion and that story in Catholicism in Europe. So that's just an example of when we start to introduce new ideas and when they become like fundamentally a part of a culture. So right around that time, and then moving more into the 12th century, the 12th century in Europe is when Catholicism introduces marriage. So marriage existed, okay? Marriage absolutely existed for Mesopotamia, but the 12th century is when the Catholic Church absorbs that tradition and creates a religious ceremony around it. So that's when marriage becomes something that is part of the religion. And that's also when you really see the turn away from homosexuality, right? This sanctifying of the relationship between a man and a woman under Christ, with Christ's blessing, et cetera, et cetera, also leads to kind of the washing out of any homosexuality that was still open in Europe. So there are many different cultures who have had openly homosexual, like, acceptance of homosexuality. The Greeks, the Romans, the Japanese, until the Japanese attempted to become more Western when they opened in 1853, and then later after World War II. Homosexuality between men was a normal part of society. So I'm touching on a lot of different things, but I'm trying to introduce the idea that even though today we think that it's normal for cultures to be sort of anti-homosexual and to just be introducing the idea that gay people have the same rights as other people, it's actually something that has that movement away from homosexuality had to start somewhere. Does that make sense? So today we're looking at a time in US history where same-sex couples are being more and more recognized and open, and we think it's new. And so what I'm telling you is that there was a time in history where anti-homosexuality had to be introduced. And so in different places, it was introduced by different people. It was introduced by the Catholic Church. In Europe, it was introduced by different cultural functions in different parts of the world. And I might have just confused you all by going off about the crucifixion, but essentially what I was trying to say is that some of the things that we think of as normalized in our culture actually had a key time that they were introduced. So the story of the crucifixion becomes a big deal in Europe at one point as a way of creating a divide between Catholics and Jews. Homosexuality becomes something that becomes a negative when marriage gets introduced as a religious ceremony. By the way, that's the same time that priests were no longer allowed to get married. Priests had gotten married before the 12th century, but celibacy is introduced in the 12th century. And it's done because of a couple of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons was if a priest got married, then he would have an heir, and that heir could lay claim to church property. And the 12th century is really when the church was gaining a lot of notoriety in Europe, and it was controlling a whole lot of property. So again, with ideas about sexuality, while we're talking mostly homosexuality today, there's different parts of sexuality that are thought of as kind of normalized, like priests are celibate, and that's been a part of the church forever. But it's actually only been a part of the church since the church in Europe started to gain a whole lot of land holdings. And as they did, they didn't want priests to have heirs who would challenge the church for property rights. Does that make sense? It was also an issue because a lot of priests were becoming like intergenerational. That was another issue. Okay, so, and all that I'm talking about right now is just to introduce the idea that some things that we think of as fundamental to our culture had to be introduced at one point, and they haven't always been fundamental. So when we look at gender and sexuality, because gender has a big part of this as we talk about transgender, if we were in class, I would ask you to tell me what all these letters mean. And notice that I have two here. I have one very, very long stretch of letters and one that is LGBTQ+. And so the LGBTQ+, or queer, is the way that we refer to the gay community, the homosexual community today. And all of these letters have some identifiers. So L, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual. Some people would say this is ally. Other people would say that this is agender. And then P for pansexual, and then two for of two spirits. So let me go over these a little bit. And I'll come back to these four that we're probably most familiar with. But queer for a long time was a derogatory term, and it's one of those terms that was reclaimed. You know how there's terms that are used against a community and then they can be reclaimed. So queer is one of those words that has been reclaimed and has become kind of an umbrella term for all the people who are part of this community. And then questioning is just the idea that some people are questioning their sexuality. Intersex used to be referred to as hermaphrodite. So that's one of the reasons that this whole spectrum is really broad, is that it includes things that aren't necessarily aspects of sexuality. So being trans isn't an aspect of sexuality, it's an aspect of gender. And being intersex isn't an aspect of sexuality either. Being intersex has to do with having ambiguous genitalia. So you're not trans if you're intersex, you have ambiguous genitalia. And then being agender, again, has to do with, or asexual, has to do with, so we'll start with agender, that, you know, we have these definitive ideas of female and male, but then some people don't identify as either. Those would be agender people. And that's why when I talked about Jacob over here, I first said he, and then I corrected myself and said they. That is because this is a person whose pronoun is they. They have male genitalia, so for a long time they went by he, but they are agender, so they go by they. And then asexual is a person who's not actually interested in sex. So you could have an asexual person who's not interested in any sort of romantic relationship, but you can have a romantic person who is not interested in sex, but is interested in a romantic relationship. Now, when we're in class, I have a lot of people who argue with me about these types of things. I had one student who very adamantly said, well, that's just friends. And the thing is that it's interesting because we try very hard to identify different aspects of sexuality in an attempt to get away from general sort of sexual boxes. So if we have these very, very specific ways of falling into sexuality in our culture, and we're attempting to move away from them, it's interesting that we attempt to do that by creating a whole lot of other definitions we would then have to fit into and argue. Do you know what I mean? When we could argue that sexuality is a spectrum, that relationships and intimacy are a spectrum, and that people fall into all kinds of different parts of that spectrum, whether it has to do with your sexuality, whether it has to do with intimacy. And you know that if you've been intimate with any person on any level, you know that there's different degrees of intimacy, and that intimacy often doesn't include sex, but isn't a friendship. So one thing about this P, when I go over this in class, I'll usually ask people to identify what all these letters are. And I've had people in the past say that the P stands for pedophile. So, and I had this one student in particular who said that and then laughed about it like it was a joke. And it's interesting because I've seen this question of pedophilia, and I've seen that there's this like small, very, very marginalized minority. I shouldn't have said marginalized. I did not mean that. I meant to say vocal minority. So there has been a small vocalized minority, not at all marginalized, of people who are pedophiles who think that they should be part of this spectrum, as in pedophilia is a type of sexuality. There are some people who believe that. And here's the problem with that, is that every single part of this spectrum, every letter on the spectrum has to do with consenting adults. Pedophilia does not. Pedophilia does not have anything to do with consenting adults. It's the molestation of people who are under the age of consent. So the reason that you could argue, and that I've argued in class when I have people who say, well, pedophilia should be part of this, is that you don't have two consenting partners in a in a in that kind of a relationship, for one. But I also want to note that in the past, I've had students who make that as a joke, like, oh, pedophiles should be included in here. And I want to bring light to that because I think that it shows that we still have this underlying prejudice that somehow people who are part of the queer community are sexual deviants. And so while a pedophile is a sexual deviant, the consenting adults who are part of this actual spectrum are not. It's a spectrum of sexuality, right? Then over here, the two has to do with Indigenous Americans. So Indigenous Americans, many, many different Indigenous cultures had this third gender, two spirits. So that third gender being close to maybe a person who identifies as a gender, maybe a person who identifies as they for their pronouns. But that two refers to Indigenous cultures that had the option, the third gender as part of their culture. So a lot of people, because there's many other letters we could fit in here, we could fit aromantic in here, we could fit demisexual in here, we could continue going on with these letters, which is why some people say it's LGBTQ plus, as in everybody else under the queer umbrella. Oh, and I didn't even say what pansexuality was. I went into this whole thing about pedophilia and how that's not what the P stands for. But then I didn't tell you what the P stands for. The P stands for pansexual. So the best way I've ever heard this described was in the show Schitt's Creek, where David talks about his pansexuality and he talks about wine. And he says, sometimes I like white wine and sometimes I like red wine. And occasionally I've had a rosé and sometimes I've had a Chardonnay that used to be a red wine. That makes sense? When it comes to sexuality, as in you like the wine, not the label. That's literally what he says in that show. So pansexuality is about liking the person, not their label. Whether their label is gender, whatever their label is, it's about liking the person. So then what about this T? Or actually, let me go back to the L, G, and the B. Because the L and the G are the two that we're most familiar with in culture and society. And Dave Chappelle has a great way of explaining that in one of his comedy specials that involves a car and a gay man driving the car and a lesbian next to him and a bisexual person in the back and then a trans person all the way in the back. And it's a good analogy for society. But one thing that I'll ask in class that I don't get to ask right now is which one of these is more likely to be out? So lesbian or gay? The response I usually get in class is lesbian, that women are more likely to be out than gay men. And I always find that interesting because it's actually gay men. About 78% of gay men are out and 73% of gay women are out, of lesbians are out. So, and again, you might ask how we even know that. Well, 1 in 10 of us are supposed to be gay or supposed to be queer. So if 1 in 10 of us are queer, it would show that about 78% of gay men are openly gay and 73% of gay women are openly gay. And the reason it surprises me that people think, usually my classes think that more women are out than men is, I don't know, it's interesting. You know, what do you all think? Why would one group be more likely to come out than another group? And I'll leave that for you all to think about. And then let's go to the bi, the B. And the bisexual, only 28% of bisexual people are out, only 28%. So it's a really, really low number of people who are actually out. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is being bisexual. People, if you're a bisexual woman, for example, people often think that you're just, you know, a sexual deviant who just wants to have sex with everybody and has no qualms about not having sex with people. Another reason is that if you are bisexual and you end up in a same-sex relationship, so bisexual woman, and you end up in a relationship with another woman, people often count you as lesbian. Whereas if you're a bisexual woman and you end up in a permanent or spousal relationship with a man, people often think of you as straight. And that whole bisexuality phase was just something you went through in college. right? So one of the reasons that this number is very low is because people tend to herd bisexuals into straight or gay depending on their partner. And that's a real issue if you think about it, that our sexuality becomes identified through our partner rather than through us, you know? So think about that. All right, and then let's go to the T's, and I have 3 T's down here. So transgender, I'm sure you mostly probably know, but a transgender person is someone who is born biologically male or biologically female who identifies as female or male, not what they are biologically. So if you have a person who is biologically male but identifies as female, they're referred to as a trans woman. If you have a person who is biologically female but identifies as male, they are a trans man. So transgender refers to a person who is born biologically one way but identifies gender-wise another way. Okay, so that's our first T. It just refers to gender and identity. It doesn't refer to anything about your body yet. It just refers to, I was born with male genitalia, but I identify as female. I'm a woman. The second T, that's when you start to get into transformation of your body. That's not what that T stands for. That T stands for transsexual. So the second T is, okay, let's say I was born with male genitalia and I'm female. I could start to take hormones. I would take estrogen. I could take it, there's all kinds of ways to take estrogen. You can take it in a pill. You could take it in a cream. Like you can literally put it on your body. If you are born female and you identify as male, you can get a testosterone cream. You can take testosterone pills. If you are born male but are female, you would take testosterone blockers. So you would attempt to block your testosterone. That's one way. You take estrogen, plus you block the testosterone that you have. So that is transsexual, when you start actually doing things to alter your body, whether it's hormonal or hormonal plus operations, right? Plus surgery. So you can have top surgery, both male and female. So a trans woman and a trans man could both have top surgery. One is removal of, one is addition of, and then you can have bottom surgery. Now, it's not actually that common for trans people to have bottom surgery. Bottom surgery is very expensive, and depending on if you're trans female or trans male, there's different results. So we have more, I should say, surgical experience. There's more people who go from male to female surgically. It's less expensive to go from male to female. So to have what's called a vaginoplasty, and sometimes I hear students and other people who will be like, yeah, well, it's easier to take away than it is to add, but that's so incorrect, because the concept there is that women don't have genitalia because you don't have this like outward penis that you're removing, which you're not removing it. But this whole idea that somehow, and I've heard that said many times, that it's easier to take away than it is to add. In both cases, you are manipulating. You're not taking away and you're not adding. You are manipulating the genitalia that's already there. So it's less expensive, and we have more, I should say, surgical progress when it comes to trans women as opposed to trans men. So vaginoplasties, we have more surgical knowledge, if that makes sense, to create a vagina out of a penis, as opposed to the other way around. What happens with the other way around is usually something to do with the clitoris. So either enlarging the clitoris into something that looks more penis size, or using the clitoris as a head on top of a surgical shaft, if that makes sense. So basically, you surgically create a shaft of a penis, and then the clitoris becomes the head of that penis. That would be the surgical way to go about transitioning from male or to female. So that second T has to do with actual actual transit, like physical transition, taking hormones, doing surgery. So T transgender has to do with gender identity. T transsexual has to do with actual movement towards whether it's testosterone, estrogen, whether it's surgery. And then the third T that a lot of people kind of confuse in this transgender spectrum is transvestite. So transvestite is just a person who dresses in the clothing and maybe the makeup of the opposite sex. So a drag queen, for example, would be a transvestite. And this really has none of these have actually anything to do with sexuality. They all have to do with gender. If you're transgender, if you're transsexual, if you're a transvestite, none of them actually tell anything about your sexuality. You can be a trans female, and once you have transitioned to being female, you can be a lesbian, right? Whereas you would have started with the genitalia of a man, transition to the genitalia of a woman because you're female, but you're still interested in women, meaning that you're lesbian, right? Or you can have people who transition and are interested in the opposite sex. So the transvestite really has nothing to do with sexuality or even necessarily with gender identity. So being a drag queen or drag king, which is a woman who dresses up like a man, and there are such thing as drag king shows, has more to do with, so you can be a gay man who doesn't identify as female, but who works as a drag queen, or you can be a straight man who doesn't identify as gay, who doesn't identify as female, but dresses up like a drag queen. Drag queens aren't the only way that we see transvestitism. So to be a transvestite, one way that you've probably heard of is a drag queen, but actually 93% of transvestites are straight men. So 93% of transvestites are straight men, and they're not people who are going like full drag. They tend to be like straight men who might be wearing women's panties. That's like the most common form of transvestitism. And you might wonder, why would you do that? It's a stress release, and I totally get it. So when we look at transvestites, we're talking about a manner of dress. And now I've seen not just transgender people, but other people right now there's kind of a backlash against some drag queens, as in drag queens aren't trans people. Yeah, they're not transgender people or transvestites. They never really claim to be. But the importance of especially drag queens is that for such a long time, and still there's so much transphobia. So there's still so much transphobia today, but for such a long time it was seen as such a deviant part of a person's personality. You could be lobotomized, having part of your brain cut out. You could be locked up in prison in this country. You could go to a mental institution because you were trans for a long time in this country. So the presence of drag queens, which drag queens are it's usually a comedic show. There might be some singing. It was a way of presenting an alternative way of looking at gender to a culture that was really scared of looking at gender in any other way than the cultural heteronormative way that we view gender. So what I'm trying to say is that drag queens, while they're not trans people, they introduced a way of dealing with gender that allowed you to be more fluid when talking about gender and not have it just threaten people as sexual deviants. So for a long time, people just thought trans people were just sexual deviants. And then you have people who did drag shows that allowed you to kind of laugh, kind of relax. And so I'm arguing that it was a way of introducing a life that was seen as highly threatening. And one of the best ways to introduce any kind of subject that scares people, that is threatening to people for whatever reason, is to do it with humor. So there you go. So speaking of sex and culture here in the US, it all comes from this idea of natural sex. So this once again goes back to me talking about Catholicism in Europe and how Catholicism, Christianity, we're going to talk next week about religion. Christianity gets started in Southwest Asia, in Jerusalem and Israel. and it gets introduced to Europe later, much later, a couple hundred years later, and it really starts to get a stronghold over Europe around 1,000 years after Christ died. So that doesn't mean that Christianity wasn't in Europe before that, but that's when you really see a stronghold where the Christian church becomes pretty dominant politically, economically, and that's when the Catholic Church starts introducing stuff, like I said, like that priests had to be celibate, like homosexuality became sort of this out. And just to give you an idea of how powerful the Catholic Church was becoming, like I said, you had this introduction of the story of the crucifixion as being Jews murdering Jesus. That was a way of dividing these two groups of people, the small Jewish population in Europe at the time and the larger and larger Catholic population. So, those are all signs that the Catholic Church was becoming pretty powerful. And I know that I've said this in class, and I'll say it next week when I talk about religion, but when I'm talking about religion, I'm not talking about your personal faith. I know that a lot of people hear me talk about the Catholic Church, or I might talk about another religion, and I have people who might feel like, hey, you're attacking my religion. In no way am I attacking your religion. Your faith is your faith, and nobody can challenge that. And I don't want to challenge it, and I don't have any doubt in your faith. But when I talk about religion, I'm talking about it from a cultural perspective, not from the religious perspective. I'm talking about it from the cultural perspective of what happens when religion becomes absorbed into a culture and then becomes a defining part of that culture. That really doesn't have to do with the faith. It has to do with what people do with that religion. That's one thing that we really need to figure out the difference between, because I hear lots of people talk about the culture of religion and the religion as though they're the same thing. So people will say, well, Christians do this, Christians do that. No, Christianity at its base is a religion about loving people and accepting people. What people might have done in the name of Christianity doesn't necessarily reflect the religion itself. So when I'm talking about Catholicism in Europe and the introduction of crucifixion and stuff like that, I'm not talking about your faith, and I'm not talking about Jesus. I'm talking about what some people did once that faith became absorbed into that culture. So this idea of natural sex is something that Catholic priests start to talk about around the time that the Catholic Church is becoming pretty popular in Europe. And this idea of natural sex is the reason that homosexuality becomes something that goes out of favor. So this idea that natural sex is the way that you should have sex has to do with procreation. Procreation is the act of not just having sex, but having sex with the intent to have a baby. Now, you have people who, have discussed sex forever. I mean, sex is a part of humanity. So within any culture, sex has been a way to control people. It's been something to philosophize about with people. But you have the Greeks and the Romans talking about how sexual passion distorts people, distorts a man's reason. You have ideas that the moral justification for sexual relations was just to procreate, that if you did it for any other reason, for any lustful reason, then it was going to distort your way of thinking. These are kind of the early, what eventually leads up to anti-homosexuality. And so non-procreative sex was considered unnatural. The idea of having sex for any other purpose besides creating a baby is what becomes defined as unnatural sex. And this becomes the sort of definitive way of dividing homosexuality from heterosexuality, meaning heterosexuality, you can procreate, homosexuality, you can't, so it must be unnatural. Now, here's what I would like to pose. Do heterosexual people have procreative sex every time they have sex? Meaning, do heterosexual people, is it the norm to have sex only to create a baby? I have a baby and I've never even had procreative sex. So I would say that most of us aren't actually engaging in sexual activity for the sole purpose of having a baby, which means that most of us are engaging in unnatural sex if we're engaging in sex. And you could also argue that any sex that wouldn't lead to procreation, oral sex, anal sex, et cetera, is also unnatural sex. So why does homosexuality get targeted? Why is that the one that gets singled out as being unnatural and still is singled out as being unnatural? It's because of intergenerational property. It's because it's always easy to target a minority. Queer people, we're 1 in 10 of the population, so we're always in the minority. So this is the same debate that we have today. Who can have sex with whom, under what circumstances, when, how, and for what reasons? I'm sorry, but if you're a consenting adult, it's really nobody else's business. I love to show this picture in class because it gets different reactions. And those reactions have changed through the years. When I started showing this picture 12 years ago when I started teaching, I took this picture, by the way, when I was about 21. This is in the Castro in San Francisco. And I love it for so many reasons. 1, how glamorous this woman is. 2, the reaction of the people in the background right here. They were at the Castro Street Fair. So the surprise on their face that they would see a person dressed like this. She's sitting on like one of those newspaper stands. You put a quarter and take the newspaper out. Anyway, I asked her if I could take her picture and she got into this like glamorous pose. But the reactions that I've had in class over the years have changed. When I would first show this picture for many years, the reaction in class was, oh, like I would hear people verbally, vocally just be disgusted by this picture. And that has definitely changed through the years. And I wonder if it's because people's attitudes have changed, or if it's just that people aren't quite as likely to express that sort of outwardly express that sort of opposition. You know what I mean? So tell me what your reaction is to this picture. Okay, so let's go back to 1969. That's before Stonewall. Stonewall was this dive bar, this nasty dive bar in the Village in New York, in Manhattan. And there were a lot of gay bars that were that were kind of undercover. So so this is what it was like to be gay in 1969 before Stonewall. You could be lobotomized, like I said. That was true for trans people as well as for gay people. That's where they take out a part of your brain. You could be arrested as a sexual deviant. If you've ever noticed, there's different parts of the country that still have kind of weird laws. Like in Georgia, I think it's still illegal to have oral sex. In some parts of the country, it's still illegal to have anal sex. Those all come from demonizing gay people. So those were all a way to arrest people for being gay. Now, lots of people have oral sex and anal sex. It's not just homosexuals, but it was just one of those laws that conveniently allowed you, if you saw 2 men living next door to you, they just bought a house together, oh no, they might be gay. That was the way that you could get them on being gay, if that makes sense. You could, you'd become a sexual deviant. You would be arrested and you would be a sex offender. You could be put in prison, you could be put in a mental institution. The FBI tracked materials that seemed to be gay. If you worked for the federal government, they had to fire you if you were openly gay. There were several states in the country that didn't allow you to be a teacher. The Boy Scouts, for a very long time, this is up until like 2 years ago, didn't allow you to be a troop leader if you were openly gay. The Girl Scouts have never done that, by the way. So what happens with Stonewall? So here's the thing about being gay, is if you're gay, you're gay. It doesn't matter if it's illegal or not. People are just gay or queer. So people would live a straight life. They would live in the closet. They would maybe be married to somebody of the opposite sex, maybe even have a family, but you're still gay. So there were different places in different cities where you could be gay. There were these little dive bars. They would be very dark, no windows. They were often run by the mafia, which is interesting. There were bathhouses. Bathhouses were a place where people could be openly gay. And then there were a few people who lived in some small communities where they were able to be gay in Manhattan. in San Francisco, but they were really, really small communities and they weren't the majority of the country. And then often these places, bathhouses, bars, would be raided by the police and the police would arrest you. And if you're married, if you're a gay man and you're married to a woman and you've been arrested for being in a gay bar, you're going to pay a fine and try to go home as easily as possible. So you would have a lot of people who would try to keep it under wraps. But Stonewall was different. So Stonewall happened in June of 1969. It was this dive bar that was raided by the police, and the people in the bar said, you know what, we're tired of this. You're not going to arrest us. And they rioted, and it led to a 3-day long riot, which eventually is the catalyst for the gay rights movement. And so you start to see the repealing of so many of these laws that I just described as being discriminatory against gay people. So we still have these kinds of laws. And I want you to take a break and go watch the video that I posted by John Oliver on LGBTQ discrimination laws. But these are places where you have what are called no promo homo laws, meaning that you can't talk about homosexuality in schools, or like, let's say you're having a sex ed class in Arizona, you can't talk about homosexuality as though that's an option for sex ed. And so what that leads to, I'm sure, as you know, is internalized homophobia, is continuation of this of discrimination based on people's sexuality. And also, anytime we don't talk openly about sex and about how to protect ourselves, then we're talking about issues with, well, pregnancy, but not so much with homosexuality, but with diseases. Talking openly about sexuality, as you know from taking a class from me, is something that should be normalized, because if we make it abnormal in our culture, that only leads to issues. So here's our no promo homo laws. That's what they're called. I didn't name them that. And these are places in the country where you can have anti-transgender laws still. So laws like you have to, like bathroom laws. That's something that I'm sure you've heard about. Laws that say you can only use a bathroom depending on your sex assigned to you at birth. Now, I want you to think about those laws that target people who are trying to use different bathrooms. We've had laws in this country before that have tried to keep people in or out of certain bathrooms, and it's never about the bathroom. It's never about the thing that people argue about when they say things like, oh, these sexual deviants want to come into my bathroom and they're going to molest my child or something like that. In fact, the people who are actually endangered are the trans people who are using the bathrooms. It's not anybody, it's not anybody else. And I would argue that these laws that we've created, or this, social narrative that we've created that tells certain people they can't use bathrooms, has nothing to do with protecting people. It has everything to do with dehumanizing people. It's the same thing we did when we used to have segregated bathrooms during Jim Crow, and it's the same thing that we're doing now. It's not really about bathrooms, it's about dehumanizing people and telling them that they're not normal. Religious refusals, that has to do with religious refusals to doing like making a cake for somebody. And as you would have seen in that John Oliver piece, there's a lot of people who, they'll make cakes for a dog wedding, but they won't make cakes for a same-sex wedding. So these are places where you're allowed that religious refusal. And then promoting conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is this type of therapy where you're supposed to basically be converted away from being gay. These conversion camps are horrible. The tactics that they use, the shaming that they use, the abuse that they use is absolutely horrible. And where we see people not just allowing conversion therapy, but promoting conversion therapy in Oklahoma. So one thing that might surprise you is that there's a lot of tourist dollars in the gay community. If you have a DINK, double income, no kids, Particularly, you have people with a lot of expendable income. So while some people are promoting conversion therapy or refusing to make people a cake, other people are like, we would like your dollar bills, please. So Tel Aviv is one of those cities. And this always surprises people because we live in this uh, country that's dominated by Christian thinking and Christian ideas around sexuality. And again, those aren't really Christian ideas. They're cultural ideas that have been absorbed into Christianity. Um, so Tel Aviv is in Israel, and in Judaism, homosexuality isn't actually bad. So they would, some Jews, some more conservative Jews would prefer that you're not gay, but if you are gay, well, there you go. And but most Reform Jews and other more liberal sects of Judaism really haven't had the same issues with people being gay, with Jewish people being gay. So Israel was one of the first countries who was like, yeah, we'll take your money if you want to come here. Tel Aviv is beautiful. You've got a nice beach. Come here and have a good time. Sao Paulo, Brazil is a major gay tourist destination. That always surprises people because Brazil is a pretty Catholic country. Sydney is a major tourist destination for gay people. In fact, Qantas has entire flights where they paint the plane pink, and they have like entire flights that cater specifically to same-sex couples, and they'll have like Kathy Griffin or somebody like that as entertainment on those flights for real. And that's always interesting to me because Australia is super homophobic. The place that's not super homophobic is Sydney. And in fact, if you go to Sydney, it has a lot of gay people in it. That's because the rest of Australia is so freaking homophobic that if you're gay, you end up in Sydney, which leads to, vibrant gay community, but like a higher percentage of gay people in Sydney versus the rest of Australia for sure. So here's parts of the world that still punish people for being gay. In the orange, and notice India is in there. Myanmar is in there, Uzbekistan, a lot of countries in Africa, Guyana. Guyana, by the way, is populated by mostly people who are South Asian. So homosexual acts are illegal. Homosexual acts can be punished by death. Look at all of that. That's Sudan, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Oman. Yeah. No specific laws on gay rights. So maybe you don't have, so this gray, no specific laws on gay rights. Who is that? There's just Greenland. Is that right? Who else is gray? Homosexual acts are legal. So that might surprise you. Legal. So where it's literally been legalized. And then same-sex marriage is allowed. Same-sex marriage is allowed in some jurisdictions. That's true in Australia for sure. Like I said, Sydney is pretty welcoming to gay people. The rest of Australia, no. Mexico is allowed in some jurisdictions. Homosexual acts are legal in Russia. That's interesting because Russia has a recent history of being pretty anti-homosexual. Okay. So I'll leave us off with why San Francisco. So why San Francisco became the first place in the country along the Castro, and this is the Castro right here. This is where I took that picture. If you notice, if we go back. No, go forward. Sorry, it's really not worth it. See these windows right there? And those are those windows right there, see? So this is the Castro right in here. And for a long time, this was kind of the only place where gay people could be gay people. And it became this magnet for the entire country, much like Sydney is today for the rest of Australia. And I mean, Melbourne and Brisbane, okay, they're more open, but Sydney is the place where you're going to see less, I don't know, whatever. For some reason, I'm just imagining someone in Melbourne who's like, hey, we have gay people here. Okay, yeah, you do. All right. So why San Francisco? Why does that become the place where gay people go to, especially in the 1970s? It has to do with anti-homosexuality laws in the military. So when I was young, when I was in high school, Clinton was president, and in his first 100 days, he attempted to take away the ban on homosexual people in the military. So for a very long time, we had a ban on gay people being in active military or in any military duty. And that actually leads to the don't ask, don't tell policy, which was just overturned recently in the last couple of years. But basically, Clinton comes into his presidency. He's like, let's take away this ban on gay people in the military. It's ridiculous. And people are like, oh, hell no, we're not going to do that. So it turns into, okay, well, let's just not tell anybody and let's just not ask anybody, which in itself was a pretty discriminatory law. It also speaks to how Clinton was constantly trying to make everybody happy, and that often led to something that looked like don't ask, don't tell. So if you were gay in the military, you were dishonorably discharged. And World War II happens, and the majority of Americans who are fighting in World War II fight in the Pacific theater. So they're basically on boats in the Pacific. And so if you're gay and you're found out for being gay in the Navy or in the Marines or somewhere else, you're dishonorably discharged and you're going to be dropped off at the closest US base. So if you're in the Pacific, that's going to be Hawaii, San Diego, San Francisco. And that's pretty much where we see gay people who are dishonorably discharged in World War II left. Now, if it's 1942 and you've just been dishonorably discharged from the military for being gay, are you going to go back to Iowa or Texas or Louisiana or wherever you're from? A lot of people just stayed in San Francisco or in San Diego or in Hawaii. Guess who has significant gay neighborhoods and gay populations still today? San Diego with Hillcrest, San Francisco with just San Francisco in general, but also Castro, and then Hawaii. Hawaii has a pretty big gay community as well. Because people were discriminated against and thrown out of the army, they ended up staying in this one place because they were they didn't want to go back home, right? And then they created this gay community, and it leads to a significant population of gay people, which leads to things like Harvey Milk being the first openly gay person to be elected to a political office. And it leads to Twin Peaks, which is the first, again, those windows, see right there? It leads to the first openly gay bar. So there was plenty of openly gay bars, but remember how I said that pre-Stonewall, you had these bars that were like, they were dark and dingy and they would be raided by the police. Well, Twin Peaks is this bar that's surrounded by glass, two sides glass, and it's basically the declaration that we're here and we're not hiding. So there's me at my very first Dyke March back in the day. This one is me, not this one. And I was like 21 there, so there you go. If you don't know what the Dyke March is, check it out. It is fantastic. It's gay pride, and so you have this gay pride parade on Sunday, but you have this whole festival on the Saturday night before. It starts in the Mission, and you march into the Castro. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that. Next week we're talking about religion, so a lot of what I talked about with Catholicism in Europe is an introduction to that as well. And please keep in mind that when I'm talking about religion, I'm not talking about your faith. I have my faith, you have your faith, 100% respect that. I'm talking about the cultural concept of religion, not the faith and your relationship with your religion. All right.